5 albums that cemented my obsession with progressive rock, and 5 more that made me an absolute prog freak. I started high school in the fall of 1988. There was definitely some interesting music coming out at the time, but where I grew up, it seemed like everyone else was just into glam metal like Motley Crue, Poison, and a few dozen other, even worse LA-based bands, fueled by cocaine and hairspray, more interested in a party than writing good music or learning to play their instruments. I hated that shit. Meanwhile, I was into the kind of stuff that was soon to be labeled alternative rock. REM, The Cure, U2 before they became insufferable. But before long, I discovered that the music of the 1970s was even more appealing to me. I was a burgeoning musician, and I was interested in music played by people who were, actually good at their instruments. I was also a bit of a geek. Okay, a big geek. So I wanted music that was intellectually stimulating, both for its lyrical content and its musical complexity. Yeah, I was pretty insufferable, but fortunately I wasn't alone. So my friend Mark and I embarked on a journey to discover everything we could about this mysterious and seemingly dead genre called progressive or prog rock. It was hard to be a prog fan in 1988. We didn't have the internet, there was no YouTube, no Spotify, not even Wikipedia for looking up information about bands we might be interested in. No, all we had was my copy of the Rolling Stone record guide and the special order catalog at the front counter of the sad little Musicland record store in our town's sad little mall. Rolling Stone's reviewers unanimously hated prog rock, and the parts of the genre that weren't killed by punk in the late 70s mutated into new wave bands in the 80s. By the time I was aware of it, everyone who had witnessed prog firsthand just seemed to want to pretend it had never existed. I first really paid attention to popular music, not just my mom's record collection, in 1982, when I was in 3rd grade, and our cable company started carrying MTV.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Two of my favorite songs in those early years were Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes and That's All by Genesis, but I had no idea of the history of those bands. They were just part of the tapestry of 80s pop music to me, along with Duran Duran and Michael Jackson. Little did I know that 2 of my favorite 80s bands, Yes and Genesis, would turn out to really be 2 of my favorite 70s bands. I'm getting ahead of myself. The pivotal moment for me happened in the fall of 1988, when Mark came to a sleepover at our friend Jason's house, armed with a cassette of a brand new live album by this band called Rush. I'd heard of them once or twice, but they hadn't really stuck with me. When the opening chord of Big Money blasted forth, I was immediately hooked. Our host Jason and our other friend Matt were in the same room with us, but time and space fell away, and for the next 74 minutes, the only thing that existed was this amazing music coming out of Jason's boombox. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, and I just had to have more. That live album was called A Show of Hands, but as much as I liked it, it wasn't the one that changed my musical world. That would be the first Rush album I bought with my own money. At the time, I was working my first job as a grocery bagger, making $3.69 an hour, minimum wage. One day, I used slightly more than 2 hours' pay to buy 2 Rush cassettes for $3.99 each from the cutout bin at the local Shopko. Rush, A Farewell to Kings. One of those Rush tapes was Signals, and the other was A Farewell to Kings. I loved them both, but it was almost hard to believe they were the same band. And where A Show of Hands had opened the door, A Farewell to Kings felt like fully stepping into this amazing Technicolor world I had never imagined even existed. I loved the whole album, but it was specifically the 11-minute epic Xanadu that captured my imagination. It was so intricate, so artful, so skillfully executed. It was like a rock symphony, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. Yes, Fragile. Mark remained one step ahead of me on the prog journey, and his family also owned a CD player before mine did. So a couple of months after the Rush introduction, he made me a cassette copy of his newest CD acquisition, Classic Yes. I'll admit, I wasn't sure what to make of it. I absolutely loved the opening track, Heart of the Sunrise. It was like Xanadu, but even better. But I didn't care so much for the next track, Wondrous Stories, and I would rarely listen to the rest of the album, even though I knew I liked some of the other songs. Fast-forwarding cassettes was a pain. I knew Classic Yes was a greatest hits album though, so once I had saved up enough money, this one wasn't in the cutout bin. I splurged on a copy of the original album Heart of the Sunrise appeared on, Fragile. I was entranced by the cover art, a trippy painting of an Earth-like planet breaking apart, with a Da Vinci-style flying machine escaping into space. The band name and album title were written at the top in an ornate script that seemed simultaneously medieval and futuristic. Roger Dean's cover art perfectly matched the mental imagery conjured by the music. This was a curious album, combining 4 epic yet somehow radio-friendly full band tracks with 5 solo tracks, one for each member. I especially liked drummer Bill Bruford's impossible-to-follow 35-second burst of weirdness, 5% for Nothing, which may have been a harbinger of things to come. Pink Floyd, Animals. Of course I had already heard of Pink Floyd long before this. Learning to Fly from their 1987 A Momentary Lapse of Reason album had been in heavy rotation on MTV in my middle school years. And who hadn't seen the iconic Prism album cover of Dark Side of the Moon? As I recall, Mark and I started our exploration of Pink Floyd at that logical point, one of the most popular albums of all time, but we proceeded in diverging directions from there. He got into their earlier psychedelic albums, whereas I gravitated towards the later stuff. Not too much later, though. I found The Wall to be a mixed bag, and the final cut totally unlistenable, and I still do. But I absolutely loved Wish You Were Here and especially Animals. I was also heavily into George Orwell at the time, so the parallels with his novella Animal Farm put this album over the top for me. I was drawn in initially by the expansive sonic explorations of the album's 3 main extended tracks, but soon I was also obsessed with the lyrics. The allegorical descriptions of dogs, pigs, and sheep as metaphors for different human archetypes were nothing like the dreamy, fantastical stuff I was getting from Yes. This was visceral, biting social commentary, and my 15-year-old brain was just becoming developed enough to understand it. King Crimson, Discipline. It was easy to get into Pink Floyd in small-town Minnesota in the late 1980s. King Crimson, not so much. But it wasn't just our small town. It's hard to even imagine these days, when just about everything in recorded history seems to be a click away. But in the 80s, albums would go out of print. Back then, listening to recorded music meant physical media. And manufacturing, warehousing, and distributing physical media costs a lot of money. So albums that weren't selling anymore would just stop getting made. As it turns out, the situation with King Crimson was even more complicated than that. Mark and I had unwittingly turned our attention to King Crimson at literally the absolute worst possible time. We were unaware of any of this, of course, but Robert Fripp, sole constant member of King Crimson, was at that moment embroiled in a legal battle with EG Records over the rights to the band's 70s albums. EG had hastily produced a run of very poor quality CD pressings of those albums a couple of years earlier. Fripp, understandably, was not happy and wanted the rights to remaster the albums himself. While all of this was playing out, those first CDs were pulled from shelves, and it was briefly impossible to buy those albums in any format other than used vinyl. And at the time for us, it had to be CD, or cassette if necessary. But vinyl? Used vinyl? That medium was dead. Anyway, because of the lawsuit, the only King Crimson music it was possible to buy at that exact moment was their trilogy of 1980s albums, on cassette. So that's how it went down. Mark bought Discipline, I bought 3 of A Perfect Pair, and we made copies for each other. We just kind of ignored Beat for a while. It was immediately clear to me that Discipline, the first album in the trilogy, was the best. This was something fresh and new, truly unlike any music I had ever heard, even other prog rock. Of course, this was from the 80s, not the 70s, but it also didn't sound like anything else from the 80s. Okay, it sounded a little like Talking Heads, which makes sense when you realize that Adrian Belew played with them briefly before joining the reformed King Crimson lineup in 1981. He had clearly influenced the Talking Heads' instrumental sound, just as David Byrne had influenced his vocal delivery. King Crimson was also fascinating to me because the drummer was Bill Bruford, who had been the original drummer for Yes. I scrutinized the music at a whole new level, listening to the ways his drums did and didn't sound like the drums on Fragile. I had always been interested in audio production since before I even knew the term. I'd been making my own recordings since my parents gave me a little red Radio Shack tape recorder when I was 7. Maybe I should have become a recording engineer, but I still didn't think of that as a potential career. Instead, I just honed my most useless skill, being able to guess the date of a recording within a year or two solely by its production values. But Discipline isn't all about its production. Honestly, although it's crystal clear, I think it sounds a bit too dry and thin, especially the bass. For me, the most distinctive elements really are the intricate, interlocking guitars played by Belew and Fripp, along with Tony Levin's amazingly fluid yet precise bass and Chapman stick. Genesis, Foxtrot. Genesis was the first prog band I managed to get to before Mark. I was already a fan of both 80s Genesis and Peter Gabriel in elementary and middle school. And when I learned that Peter Gabriel had actually been the lead singer of the prog-tastic 70s incarnation of the band, I just had to hear it. So on senior skip day, yes, this was a few years after the journey had started, a couple of friends and I went on a day trip to a bigger city near where I was going to be starting college in the fall. Part of our day involved going to the local mall, where I bought Foxtrot on cassette. I would end up buying a lot of CDs at that record store over the next 4 years, even though the people who worked there were obsessed with my least favorite song of all time. Foxtrot is an amazing prog feast from start to finish. From the mellotron assault of the opening of Watcher of the Skies to the epic among epics, 23-minute side 2 suite, Supper's Ready. Strangely enough, I don't own Foxtrot on vinyl, but I have a few others. What's next? Those were the 5 main prog bands Mark and I got into in our high school years, along with a few others like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, plus Brian Eno's rock trilogy, Here Come the Warm Jets, Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, and Another Green World. And one other artist I'll mention momentarily. We ended up going to different colleges, but Mark and I kept in touch via the pre-web internet. We would frequently chat over Telnet sessions, and we were also both active members of the Alt Music Progressive Usenet group. That, plus Mark living in an actual big city, St. Paul, and me having a car, meant we could get our hands on this stuff by way of some better indie record stores like the Electric Fetus and Roadrunner Records. The latter actually had a dedicated progressive rock section at the time. But before we went off to college, there was one other supremely weird, prog-adjacent artist we discovered in high school, Captain Beefheart. Sure, it's hard to argue that Don Van Vliet himself was a progger, but the insanely complex arrangements he dictated to John Drumbo French and the members of the band who actually managed to pull off playing them after months of brutal rehearsals were, if anything, even more challenging than anything attempted by Yes or Genesis. And so, Trout Mask Replica is an album everyone who's interested in progressive music needs to hear. The summer after we graduated high school, our other friend Matt and I took a day trip to visit some musician friends who had graduated a year ahead of us and were now deeply entrenched in college life. They played us a concert bootleg by a band I had never heard of, Fish. That day when we got back to town, I went straight to Musicland and was delighted to find a copy of their latest album, A Picture of Nectar. Sure, Fish is known more for their live jams than their studio albums, and today you can download a recording of almost every concert they've ever played direct from their website. But if you haven't heard A Picture of Nectar before, you really should check it out. I couldn't believe a band playing music this complex could get signed by a major label and put out an album like this in 1992. In college, besides continuing my deep dive into the work of Genesis, I found their first post-Peter Gabriel album, A Trick of the Tail, to be especially satisfying. I got seriously into Gentle Giant. I discovered their existence thanks to that old Rolling Stone record guide of all things. As much as their reviewers hated prog, they certainly liked to write about how much they hated it. And they hated very few bands as much as they hated Gentle Giant. They actually gave one of Gentle Giant's albums a rare bullet, the rating they reserved for albums they despised so intensely that even a single star was too much. Of course, like most Gentle Giant fans, I recognize The Power and the Glory as their masterpiece. A subgenre Mark and I became particularly interested in was Canterbury. It was less rigidly structured than most prog rock, with more focus on jazzy textures and improvisation, kind of like what Fish would produce 20 years later. Many of the musicians rejected the label Canterbury because most of them had little, if any, geographical connection to that part of England, besides Robert Wyatt of Soft Machine. My favorite example of the style is from somewhat of a Canterbury supergroup that played mainly in the late 1970s, National Health. All three of their albums are great, but the second, Of Cues and Cures, is my favorite. And finally, does prog get any weirder than Captain Beefheart? Of course it does. How about a French jazz fusion prog crossover that doesn't deal just in concept albums, but an entire concept discography, documenting the voyages of humans who escape an apocalyptic Earth and form a new civilization on a planet called Kobaya. Oh, not weird enough? Well, what if all of their lyrics are sung in Kobayan, a language invented by the band's drummer and principal composer? Yeah, I thought so. Incredibly enough, Mark and I actually got to see Magma live at a small club in Chicago called Martyrs in 1999. It was part of a very brief tour, which, to my knowledge, was the first and last time the band ever performed in the United States. Oh, and I almost got into a fight with a drunk guy who kept stumbling backwards into me and yelling, "The last 7 minutes!" between every song. That's a song in the band's late 70s album, Attack, that was a half-hearted attempt at commercial success. He might as well have been yelling Freebird. Good times. Other prog bands. Yes, there's a lot more to progressive rock than the 10 bands and albums I covered here. There are a few very popular ones I just never could get into, like Jethro Tull, Renaissance, and Marillion. Then there's the more modern wave that started with prog's reawakening in the 90s. Bands like Dream Theater, Porcupine Tree, the Mars Volta, and Coheed and Cambria. Eventually, my musical taste drifted, first to prog-adjacent bands like Radiohead, and from there in a more electronic direction, to stuff like Air and Boards of Canada. When synthwave hit, I became obsessed with Com Truise and Tycho. More recently, I've been listening to and playing mostly jazz. But I haven't forgotten all of the prog bands I obsessed over in high school and college. Besides the ones I've already mentioned, there were, Alan Parsons Project, Anderson Bruford Wakeman Howe, Anecdoten, Area, Artzoid, Bowdoon, Brand X, Bruford, Bubble Math, California Guitar Trio, Camel, Can, Caravan, Egg, Focus, Frank Zappa, Gilgamesh, Gong, Greenslade, Happy Family, Hatfield in the North, Henry Cow, Kansas, Liquid Tension Experiment, Moving Gelatine Plates, The Muffins, Ozric Tentacles, Philharmony, The Pineapple Thief, PFM, Projects 1 through 4, Samla Mamas Mana, Soft Machine, Styx, The Sin, Thinking Plague, Transatlantic, Utopia, Vandergraaf Generator. That's not a complete list.